Imagine a world where one country owns time itself. In the mid-1960s, Switzerland didn't just manufacture watches, they were the guardians of history. They commanded 50% of the global market and nearly all of the industry's profits. It was an empire built on tiny gears, intricate springs, and centuries of silence in the Alps. But empires don't fall because of weak walls. They fall because of blind arrogance. The irony is cruel. The Swiss actually discovered the technology first. Their best engineers had created a prototype for an electronic movement, accurate, efficient, and revolutionary. But when they presented it to the heads of the prestigious watchmaking families, they were met with laughter. "This has no balance wheel," the masters scoffed. "It has no soul. It is a gadget, not a timepiece." They were so intoxicated by their own perfection that they didn't even patent the prototype. They believed that no true gentleman would ever abandon the romance of mechanics for a battery. They assumed the world would play by their rules forever. While the Swiss turned their backs on the future, convinced that tradition was invincible, a hungry competitor across the ocean was watching. Everyone in Europe said it was impossible to mass-produce this technology, but in Japan, Seiko decided that if the Swiss wouldn't do it, they would. Quartz technology was not a secret, it was a beast that no one knew how to tame. In the 1950s, a quartz clock was the size of a refrigerator and required a massive power source. The idea of shrinking this behemoth to fit on a human wrist was considered pure science fiction. But at Seiko's Suwa factory, a secret team known as Project 59A began a mission that bordered on insanity. They weren't just trying to make a smaller clock, they had to rewrite the laws of watchmaking. The obstacles were terrifying. A standard quartz crystal consumed so much power it would drain a watch battery in hours. The Swiss had calculated the energy requirements and declared the project physically impossible. They stopped there. Seiko, however, viewed impossible as a design flaw. Their engineers had to invent entirely new components from scratch. They developed the open stepping motor, a device that moved the second hand only once per second to conserve energy. And they created their own integrated circuits because none existed that were small enough. While the Swiss masters slept soundly in their beds, believing their heritage would protect them, Seiko's engineers were working through the night, betting their careers on a technology that the rest of the world had already dismissed as a failure. On December 25, 1969, while the world celebrated Christmas, Seiko quietly delivered a death sentence to the old world. They unveiled the Astron. It cost as much as a new Toyota car, a price that made the Swiss elite scoff. They dismissed it as an overpriced toy for the eccentrically rich, believing their centuries-old dominance was safe. But they were looking at the price tag when they should have been looking at the accuracy. The Astron was 100 times more precise than the finest mechanical chronometer in existence. It didn't rely on gravity or fragile springs. It vibrated at a frequency that redefined timekeeping itself. The Swiss saw the high cost and breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the threat was contained. They failed to realize that in the world of electronics, today's luxury is tomorrow's commodity. Seiko had cracked the code. The barrier of impossibility was gone, and the only thing left to do was to make it cheap. The dam had cracked, and the Swiss were too busy admiring their own reflection to notice the water rising around their ankles. The Swiss pinned their survival on a fatal assumption that the technology would remain expensive. They believed quartz would stay a niche luxury for the wealthy, leaving the mass market to their reliable mechanical gears. But technology is a cruel accelerator. What the Swiss masters failed to understand was that they were no longer competing against other watchmakers. They were competing against Moore's law. Within a few short years, the price of quartz technology didn't just drop, it evaporated. American companies joined the fray, pushing costs down with ruthless efficiency. A mechanical movement required a master's touch, expensive materials, and months of labor. A quartz circuit required a machine and seconds of printing. By the mid-1970s, you could buy a digital watch for less than $10. This was the true terror. Suddenly, a plastic watch sold at a gas station was 10 times more accurate than a gold heirloom passed down for 3 generations. The value proposition of the Swiss industry was annihilated overnight. Why pay a month's salary for a device that loses minutes every week when pocket change could buy you perfection? Time was no longer a privilege of the elite, it had been democratized. The Swiss watch was no longer a masterpiece, it was an overpriced anachronism, a horse and buggy in the age of the jet engine. The valleys of the Jura Mountains, once alive with the rhythmic ticking of a million escapements, fell into a terrifying silence. It was a massacre of heritage. Of the 1,600 watchmaking firms that defined Swiss excellence, over 1,000 declared bankruptcy and ceased to exist. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a free fall. 60,000 artisans, men and women who possessed skills honed over generations, were thrown onto the street. These were not assembly line workers, they were artists who found themselves in a world that no longer wanted their art. Equipment worth millions was sold by the pound as scrap metal. Prestigious brands that had adorned the wrists of royalty were liquidated for pennies. The Swiss didn't just lose market share, they faced the total erasure of their culture. To the rest of the world, it was the dawn of digital convenience. To the Swiss, it was the apocalypse. The industry was not just on its knees, it was in the grave, buried under a mountain of cheap Japanese plastic. By the early 1980s, the Swiss banks had seen enough blood. They prepared to sell the crown jewels, Omega and Longines, to the Japanese for scraps. The surrender was all but signed. But into this funeral marched Nicolas Hayek, a consultant who refused to let the patient die. He looked at the devastation and realized that fighting the Japanese on accuracy was a losing war. He decided to fight a war of emotion. He proposed a heresy, a Swiss watch made of cheap plastic. The traditionalists were horrified, but Hayek understood what they didn't, that a watch could be an accessory, a statement of style rather than just a keeper of time. He forced engineers to reduce the internal components from 91 to just 51, creating a fully automated sealed unit that could be produced for peanuts. This was the Swatch. It was a colorful, disposable shield designed to protect the dying heart of the industry. The plan was a paradox. They would sell millions of cheap plastic watches to fund the resurrection of the expensive mechanical ones. It was the last roll of the dice. The Swatch stopped the bleeding, but it was a philosophical shift that truly healed the wound. The industry realized that in a world rushing toward the digital future, analog was no longer a weakness. It was the ultimate luxury. They stopped selling devices to tell the time and started selling pieces of eternity. The Quartz Crisis stripped the mechanical watch of its primary function. It was no longer necessary for daily life, and that was its salvation. Because it was no longer a tool, it became art, it became jewelry, it became a status symbol. Today, we don't buy a Rolex or a Patek Philippe to know if we are late for a meeting. We have our phones for that. We buy them because they are inefficient, complex, and beautifully obsolete. We pay thousands of dollars not for the time, but for the story of how the time is kept. The crisis forced the Swiss to retreat to the very top of the mountain, abandoning the mass market to seize the crown of exclusivity. The cheap quartz watch didn't kill the Swiss industry, it purified it. It forced them to admit that their value wasn't in precision, but in emotion. In the end, the Swiss lost the battle for accuracy, but they won the war for the wrist. The $10 watch conquered the world, but the mechanical watch conquered our dreams. Tradition, it turned out, was not defenseless against technology. It just had to become a legend to survive it.